Not that I'm not concerned about AI. My main concern about AI is what other human beings are going to do with it, rather than what it's going to do to us. Both Stephen Hawking and Noah Harari have said that humans are basically information processing. Machines process information, therefore they're more human than we are. We argue against that in the book.
I've sometimes read Harari and think he's rather looking forward to the day when Google takes over. Another guest we spoke to, he basically said on this show, he thinks AI is basically the Antichrist. It's demonic, essentially. We're kind of opening up a portal to something we literally don't know. Are we kind of unleashing something, and will it take over?
Welcome to another episode of Re-Enchanting. We are the podcast from Seen and Unseen, and I am Belle Tindall.
I'm Justin Brierley.
And we, as usual, are going to be discussing whether our arguably disenchanted world, our materialistic society, can be re-enchanted with the wonder and the mystery of the Christian faith once more.
Today, we are re-enchanting aliens, animals, and AI with Nick Spencer. Nick, welcome along.
Thank you.
Nick is Senior Fellow at Theos and hosts their podcast, Reading Our Times. He's the author of a number of books and reports, including Magisteria, the entangled histories of science and religion, and his most recent book, co-authored with Hannah Waite, Playing God, Science, Religion, and the Future of Humanity. Just a few small topics to address.
You like to keep it light, I could see, yeah.
Now, Playing God deals with a number of issues that aren't conventionally maybe lumped under the sort of science and faith discussion. And today we are going to be chatting about just three of the ones you outline in the book, Nick: aliens, animals, and AI. Looking at some of the boundaries of science and technology, maybe asking what re-enchants ultimately what makes us human as well. So welcome along to the show.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here.
But before we get on to any of that, we have a signature question, which we were discussing just before this. We're usually at the top of Lambeth Palace Library, and our question is inspired by that location. But we are in the crypt right now, and
Yes.
we can't think of a signature question that's crypt-inspired.
Several episodes of this season have been down here in the crypt, which is a wonderful location to
Beautiful.
film. But we do feel like we need a different question to the book's question.
But we can't think of one.
What's your favourite underground area? It probably doesn't quite evoke as much interest as
Absolutely not.
as the book question. So we'll stick with the books.
We'll stick with the book-inspired question, which is...
What are you reading
What
at
are
the
you
moment?
reading?
I'm a pretty chronic bibliophile. This is a risky question to ask. I have lots of books on the go in no particular order. I'm reading the collected letters or selected letters of Seamus Heaney and a collection of essays by Seamus Heaney. I'm a great fan. I'd like to write something on him one day. I've just started a book on the history of the Palestinian conflict because I've not read one for 20 years or so, and it's very relevant at the moment.
Yeah.
I've always got a book of theology on the go. At the moment, it's Prophecy and Discernment by Walter Moberly. I've got 2 or 3 volumes of poetry on the go. And I'm trying to read more fiction. That's been in abeyance for me for a long time. So I've finally read Robinson Crusoe, or nearly read Robinson Crusoe. Though those half dozen or so are best way to start.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm sensing you're just scratching the surface there as well. And it's very impressive.
Do you have a massive stack next to your bed?
It's obscene. It's no longer next to my bed. It's in the spare room, and I've got to the stage now where I smuggle books home so my wife doesn't see.
Oh, wow! You're one of those.
Is she going to put in the 1 in, 1 out rule?
Well, I've got to do. I've got nowhere to put them anymore.
Yeah.
I can't bring myself to keep them in the garage. So yeah, 1 in, 1 out.
This thing
1 in,
called
1 out.
Kindle, where you can have lots of books in
Right, I'm
digital
off.
form.
Yeah. You nearly lost a guest and a co-host there.
Sorry. Well, anyway, that probably is the most number of books we've had at one time so far. So well done for being up there on the leaderboard.
Yeah.
Tell us about your books, though, particularly this new one. I think it's emerged from a big project you've been sort of part of for the last maybe up to 7 years, Nick, at Theos. The relationship of science and faith. Hundreds of hours, I think, of conversations and surveys and all kinds of things. Tell us kind of firstly about that and how it led to this new book.
Yeah, so I guess there were 2 origins to Playing God. One is this research project that you talk about. That involved interviewing over 100 leading philosophers, academics, sociologists, theologians, science communicators, active scientists, with this single option of trying to understand what science is and what religion is. Everyone's got an opinion of how science and religion get on. But actually, how you think they got on is entirely predicated on what you think they are. And that is not a straightforward question. So you can say that science and religion are perfectly compatible, or they're incompatible, or they're non-overlapping magisteria. But unless you define what science is and what religion is, that relationship is more or less immaterial. So the whole research project was an attempt, a very expensive and long attempt, to try and define two words. There's a book coming out, a kind of monograph coming out next year that delves into that in detail. But before then, the research process kicked up lots of very interesting subjects. And I wanted to cover those in a slightly more accessible way than the monograph. And that keys into the second approach, which is, you mentioned, I think in your introduction, I read a history of science and religion that came out last year called Magisteria, the entangled histories of science and religion. And that did a couple of things. It argued that the popular perception that they've always been in conflict is simply wrong. There certainly have been moments of tension. But interestingly, those moments of tension, and generally speaking, the moments when the science and religion relationship get interesting, is when we talk about human nature. What is a human and who gets to decide? The book ended in end of the 20th century, bit of AI, and it struck Hannah and me afterwards that actually this is going to be the question in the 21st century. Our capacity to understand, to modify, to improve the human has come on leaps and bounds in the last 20 years or so. It's only going to get more important. And it's a question to which religion has got a lot to contribute. Hence, we thought we'd write a book about it.
Wow. So it's something of a sequel to Magisteria, but sort of taking us right into the present sort of debates and so on. I love the title, Playing God. Though you write in the introduction, throughout we insist that the familiar warning against playing God has no place in these debates. On the contrary, humans are a God-playing species. I love that line. What do you mean, though, by us being a God-playing species?
Well, I think most people will be familiar with the warning, don't play God. And it's usually evoked when we hear some kind of genetic modification.
Yeah.
This is wrong. This is against nature. Well, agriculture is against nature. Humans have been genetically modifying the created order for 7,000-8,000 years or so.
Yeah.
Actually, in one sense, all creatures are modifying their immediate environment.
Yeah.
Humans are uniquely able to do so with a particular rationality, imagination, and foresight. Not to say we always use those things, but we're capable of using those things. And I think you can mount pretty strong scriptural arguments that that's what we're here to do. We're a gardener species, if you like, or we're a playing God species. The question is not whether we should do so, but as I put it in the book, what kind of God you should play, or less nomically, what's your end? What's your objective? What are your values and virtues that shape the way that we modify our immediate environment?
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think in the introduction you write this line, which is so interesting, because you say this book is about the future that is arriving daily, which is such a good, satisfyingly written line. But this idea that the future is not something we're going to bump into at some point, that we take a piece for today and we take it into tomorrow, and then we keep doing that. And your book, all of the topics, is that how you came to the specific topics you tackle? Because as I think was said in the introduction, they're perhaps not the topics that would be expected in a book about the overlap between science and religion. So before we get into some of the topics, why these ones?
Yeah, so that's right. So I think that's another important point. When people think about the science and religion debate, most of the time people automatically play to Darwinism, creationism, Big Bang, cosmology, maybe a bit of quantum theory thrown in there for weirdness. Interesting, important, fascinating topics.
Yeah.
But actually, if the argument of Magisteria is right, that it's the nexus of the human which really matters here, I don't think they're central issues. And interestingly, this is a side note, if you look back in history about the debates about Darwinism and creationism and cosmology and so on and so forth, actually, deep down, they're very often about the human. This keeps on coming up.
Yeah.
To an extent, the topics there selected themselves because we wanted to write about not only what we'd spoken to our interviewees about, but what was in the news headlines. And I put that line in there because, as you know, there's a gap of anywhere between kind of 3 and 9 months between submitting a manuscript and it coming out. And these stories were coming out daily. I mean, in the case of AI, hourly,
Yeah.
really. And there was a
Yeah.
concern that, everything might have changed
Yeah.
by the time the book came out from when we submitted it. So it's partly the fact that, this is happening all the time. And we want to kind of just pick up some of the tendrils that people are reading about in your newspapers. That dates me, doesn't it? People don't read newspapers. People are reading about on Twitter, online,
Yeah.
and reflect on them in a bit more detail.
Yeah.
Brilliant. I mean, one of the early chapters is on, again, not a topic you might immediately expect in this area, aliens. Is there life out there somewhere? I guess that's been the subject of countless science fiction movies and books and so on. There's this phrase, though, that I often hear, but I'm never quite sure exactly what it means. Fermi's paradox. Can you tell us what Fermi's paradox is and what it says about the possibility of alien life?
So it's basically, where are they?
Yeah.
That's what it boils down to. Enrico Fermi came up with this question about 100 or so years ago. If the universe is teeming with life, where is everybody? I think he actually said. Now, it's a perfectly good question. As it happens, I think it's wrong, so to speak, as it were. A question can't be wrong. But I think the conclusion that Fermi wanted to draw from it, i.e. we're alone, is wrong, simply because of the numbers. Roughly 100 billion stars in the galaxy, 100 billion galaxies in the universe, although might double each of those figures. That's a vast number of stars. We've discovered in the last 30, 40 years or so that exoplanets, so that's planets orbiting stars outside of our solar system, seem to be not just far more common than we thought they might be, but actually virtually everywhere. NASA have discovered something like 5,000 of them. As with our solar system, the vast, vast majority of them are probably totally inhospitable to life and always will be. But when you've got 100 billion squared possible stars, many of those having planets around them, you don't have to have a high possibility of life to have a high likelihood that there is life somewhere or other. So if I were a betting person, I would say almost certainly there's life and arguably intelligent life elsewhere. We may never contact it. Very, very far away, communication very difficult. We may not want to, but my gut feeling is that we're not alone.
Right. That's interesting. I mean, that then raises the question, if we ever did get to the point of somehow making contact, SETI suddenly did receive a signal from somewhere, would that affect the Christian faith? I often meet people who seem to think that this is an objection to Christian faith. Well, how would your faith stand making contact with intelligent life? I don't know. I've never particularly felt like that's a strong objection. I personally haven't particularly read anything in scripture that would say this is a complete, anomaly or something. So what's your view on that?
So you're certainly right. That is a very common view. I remember conducting research interviews years ago when one young man said to me, very hostile interviews, saying, I really hope they do find alien life elsewhere because that would disprove the Christian faith. As a researcher, you're poker faced, you don't respond to that. But I thought, would it really? The logic here is this. The Christian faith thinks humans are unique. Aliens turn up. We're no longer unique. QED, Christian faith, or the central claim of the Christian faith is not true. I think that's flawed in lots of different ways. But the first one is that it confuses value with uniqueness. It makes the assumption because there is only one of something, it is valuable. Now, that's not the case in the Christian scriptures. It certainly hasn't been the case in Christian theology. Something is valuable because it's valued. It's actually as simple as that. You don't love an only child more than you do their sibling. And actually, what's going on there is a pride issue, right? We think we're very rational. Aliens find us before we find them. They're clearly cleverer than we are. And all of a sudden, we're not at the top of the rationality tree. And our pride is damaged. But, the scriptures are full of our pride being damaged. I mean, it kind of more or less begins with our pride being damaged, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And the idea that, discovering alien life would fundamentally undermine the value that humans have is a much kind of secularized, anthropomorphized idea of what value is, rather than one that's central to the scriptures.
Thinking about the script. So this isn't a question that I spend a huge amount thinking about because it just makes me feel a bit queasy. Like, I don't know whether that's excitement or anxiousness. I don't know. But I suppose thinking about it now, and admittedly for one of the first times, if the Bible actually it's constantly telling us, like I'm thinking about like when God has that conversation with Job and he says, were you there when I laid the foundations of the universe? Were you there when I did that? And you know, thinking about David talking about like the stars and then like who's God that he's mindful of like a human. So I suppose if there's any source that teaches you to think that all that you know cannot be all that there is, the Christian faith, is it?
Yeah, I think so. But what you pick up there is something that has historically been lost as well, which is the very broad focus. It's not as if the scriptures and theological reflection on them has been indifferent to the environment, to other creatures, to the entirety of the created order. Now, you know, the books that get selected that we read in the Bible, they're interested in a particular species. Actually, they're interested in particular people from a particular group.
Yeah.
That particularity is central to it. But particularity, a particular interest, does not mean a disinterest or an indifference to the rest of the created order. There's a famous paper by Lynn White published about 60 years ago now, which puts the blame of the environmental crisis firmly at the door of Christianity. Christianity is the most anthropocentric of all religions. Now, there is some truth in that, in the way that some Christians in the past have understood and treated the rest of the natural world. But I don't think it's central to the Christian vision, where human destiny is ineradicably tied up with the rest of the created order. It just so happens when you're talking about astrobiology, which is the created order is just much, much bigger.
Right. I guess just before we move on to the next subject, one of the things that crosses my mind is whether it might even work the opposite way, that actually discovering extraterrestrial intelligent life might even give us a clue that there is a God. I mean, is there any arguments for that? I mean, if we did make contact and turns out they're religious too, would that kind of in any way kind of shift the dial in terms of the odds?
So there's an episode of The Simpsons.
There's always an episode
of The Simpsons, the second Holy Scriptures, where Kang and Kodos, the aliens, end their transmission by genuflecting and saying in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost.
No way.
Now, if that happened, I think it would be answered. More seriously, one has to be very careful about reading any definitive ideas about or even the existence of God from the natural world. I think that's a real problem. But you can pick up hints. And it seems to me that if life, intelligent life, minded life, even arguably morally cognizant life, was present across the universe, it would look like the universe was a put-up job, to quote a famous
I've heard Paul
phrase.
Davies say something quite similar. He's a sort of agnostic physicist, cosmologist, but who doesn't just subscribe to a kind of blind materialist kind of perspective. And I've heard him say something very similar. If there's a kind of life principle that kind of goes in the direction of consciousness, moral agency, it feels like there's something more than just blind laws at work here.
It is, and this may well tie up to a subsequent issue we talk about. Up until relatively recently, the view was evolution's random. Stephen Jay Gould, famous American paleobiologist, said that rewind the tape of life in a much more analog age, replay it, you get a completely different picture. Now, I think the broad sense of opinion is that isn't right, because there are constraints on evolution. And time again, evolution on this planet seems to navigate to certain solutions, because there's only so many ways of seeing, only so many ways of hearing, only so many ways of moving about. And the fascinating thing is that different species that diverged from one another many, many, many hundreds of millions of years ago have developed minds independently. Now, again, I don't want to make too much of this, but if that was extrapolated to countless other places in the cosmos, it might just look as if the created order was set up to generate minds and consciousness. And here's another kind of provocative thought. If you are a social creature, you need to get on with one another. The next step to that is morality. Doesn't mean being good. It means having some sense of my good versus your good and how we combine to generate a common good. Now, that is intrinsic to us as a social creature. If life was generated elsewhere amongst social creatures, maybe morality was as pregnant within creation as mind was. So you begin to get this picture that actually what looks random meaninglessness might be I think a lot of these inherent values in there that emerge slowly.
That's so fascinating. I can tell that this is going to be a topic that I'm going to move from being scared of to obsessed with. And I'll have you to blame. Just before we move on to animals, just because this is playing gods and like you say, it's all very interesting when it sort of converges on what is a human. I'm just really fascinated on your thoughts of our obsession with aliens and with finding them. And like Justin has mentioned, this isn't just, we're actually actively doing this, but then we're also writing books about it and films about it and songs about it and comic books about it and children dress up as like culture-wide fascination. What does our fascination with life in places we can't yet see, what's that tell us about who we are? What does that teach us about us?
That's a really good question. Not one we think about in the book. So this is kind of off the top of my head, really. It's an imaginative thing, isn't it? I mean, I think we've always been fascinated by aliens, but even those cultures that haven't have been fascinated by supernatural beings of some description or other.
Yeah.
So there is a kind of inherently imaginative nature. Characteristic of being human is to imagine that which we don't immediately know. But I think it's also quite a profoundly relational thing as well, because this is a version of the question of, are we alone?
Yeah.
And are there any other forms of life that we can connect with in a profound way, in the sense of, can we see ourselves in who they are, not only their existence, but the way their society operates. So I think it kind of reflects back onto us our imaginative and inherently social characteristics.
I think inevitably it's probably tied in with the point at which we've discovered just how big the universe is, and then I think kind of science fiction got going almost. I almost feel like it's when once kind of we'd more or less mapped out our immediate environment, the world, if you like, the books that were written about adventure were discovering a new continent or whatever. Now it's like, okay, well, we know where we live now. Now, Star Trek is the new kind of Columbus or whatever, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, humans being a naturally not just an imaginative but exploratory species, and if we can't explore it in person, we'll explore it mentally.
Yeah.
That's so fascinating. And particularly the relational thing. I'd never thought of that, in that we're not satisfied with just knowing they're out there. Well, in which case, communicate. We want to communicate with them. We want them to communicate with us.
Yeah, because you don't get many science fiction novels that focus on the fact that there are bacteria somewhere.
No.
That would be interesting. Hang about 4 billion years or so, you might have a conversation with them. But what we're really interested in is what kind of communication there can be.
Yeah. What would they think of us? What would we think of them? What would be the implications of us?
Yeah.
Of the friction.
Well, turning to at least some fellow inhabitants of the universe, we are aware of the existence of animals. You do a whole chapter actually kind of on personhood, really. And you begin this chapter with the sad story of Happy. Tell us the sad story of Happy.
Well, let me give you chapter and verse on that, because
Okay,
I wouldn't want to impugn Happy. Happy's a 51-year-old female Asian elephant. She's been a resident in Bronx Zoo for most of her life, and she is, by all accounts, an impressive animal. She's sensitive, intelligent, and the first Asian animal unambiguously to have passed the mirror test, which we might come on to.
Okay.
Why she's particularly important is that she has been the source of a legal argument over recent years, brought by the Non-Human Rights Project to get her legal rights as a person recognised. Not a one-off. They've brought similar cases with regards to chimpanzees, to other elephants, to bonobos, I'm not sure. Even, I believe, for dolphins and whales to be held in captivity. Predicated on the idea these are intelligent, seemingly reflective, in some cases social, possibly even moral species. Well, I know another species like that.
You and me.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We afford one another rights. Even more so, we afford rights to members of our species that don't exhibit those things because of profound cognitive impairment, for example. So why could you legitimately keep an intelligent, sensitive animal like Happy in captivity? And that's kind of the basis of that chapter.
Do you foresee that becoming a regular, like, we can name Happy because she's unique, but do you see sort of the floodgates opening with that sort of questioning?
How do you mean the floodgates opening? The legal floodgates, or?
Oh, just sort of, are those conversations that we're going to have more and more? And I suppose that will have legal implications, but those conversations they're quite, maybe they're not as rare as I think, but are we just going to start thinking about our similarities and what makes us us, and how actually it's not as black and white and it's not as easy to differentiate us from other intelligent animals?
So yes, I think is the answer because of the direction of travel of the science in this area. So each of the chapters in the book occupies a different kind of scientific niche, and it's not just a particular science, but the sciences are always developing, that are progressing in a particular way. And this one is really based on kind of zoology and primatology. And the change there has been 50, 60 years ago, there was a behaviorist mindset that dominated those disciplines, which was that these animals behave in a certain way, but they don't think, they don't reflect, they don't feel. It's actually a very old theme within the Western philosophical tradition. Descartes, 400 years ago, effectively argued that, look, when you kick a dog and it yelps, that's no more indicative of any cognitive action going on in the dog as if when you press a pedal on an organ and it makes a noise. It was said that a good Cartesian would kick a dog in public. Now, that has changed massively from behaviorism. And one of my writer I really, really love, and very sadly died just only a month or so ago, Frans de Waal, a Dutch primatologist, has been kind of pioneering this, spending a huge amount of time studying these creatures and realizing that behaviorism is just absolutely wrong. These creatures think and they feel and they're intelligent and they evaluate and they engage with one another in profound, deep social and emotional ways. My sense is that our perception of that is only going to get more and more sensitive. And the more sensitive it gets, the more pressure there will be to say, well, chimpanzees, can do so much. Why are you holding them in captivity?
I mean, there was this very popular Netflix documentary I recall. I think it was called The Octopus, My Teacher, or something like that. And again, this is one where, someone basically gets to know an octopus and suddenly discovers it's this incredibly intelligent creature, the last one you might think of.
Yeah.
And I can imagine for a lot of people who've watched that and got to know this octopus, they suddenly feel like they're going to think twice about ordering calamari, on the menu next time.
Yeah.
It's kind of, so it's sort of being made more aware of the capacities of animals.
Yeah.
And perhaps kind of breaking down some of our stereotypes, as you say, the behaviorist kind of model or whatever it is. So does that take us to the edge of saying, we should actually afford similar rights to those kinds of animals as we do to humans?
I think it does take us to the edge of saying yes. But there's a difference between rights and personhood, and that's something I would underline. We come to the conclusion in the book that animals are not persons in the sense that we use persons. We might come on to that really important word in discussion. Doesn't mean they don't have rights. I think this is really, really important. Okay. I can't cut down the trees in my back garden because there's a tree preservation order on them, and I live in a kind of green belty kind of area. My trees aren't sentient, and at least not in the way that an octopus might be sentient. As it were, they have rights. It is important to make the distinction that just because you don't recognise the legal personhood of a particular entity doesn't mean they therefore don't have rights. And if anything, this discussion for someone like me is helpful, because even if you do come to the conclusion they're not persons, legally or metaphysically speaking, you do so having been immersed in what they are capable of doing. And that means that you are more inclined to afford them rights, irrespective of the fact of whether they're persons or not.
Would now be a good time to ask you what you mean by the word persons?
Yes. It's a messy term.
Yeah.
It's often associated with the English philosopher John Locke, who has a sentence, and I can't quote it in full because it's quite long, about it's self-awareness, it's intelligence, it's other awareness, it's continuity of being. I think those are all important, but it's also a theological word. It was used in the Christological debates heavily of the 4th century to try and explain this conundrum that the early Christians were trying to grapple with. God is one, and yet the scriptures talk about Jesus as God and the Father as God and the Spirit as God. So how can God be one, or how is God three? And they appropriated a Greek word, prosopon, which translated into persona in Latin, which originally meant a mask. It was the mask that you wore in a theatre if you were acting in Greece. Now, the point about using that, I mean, there's lots of complex Greek metaphysics, and that's way beyond me. But the mask was the face you presented to the world. So a person was that kind of entity that related to other persons.
Mm-hmm.
So within Christian thought, it is a profoundly relational idea. There's a really fine French Thomist philosopher called Jacques Maritain, whom I did my PhD on, who wrote about the difference between individuals and persons. Now, lots of things are individual that kind of means just one of bounded material. But a person is, as it were, an intersection of relationship. There is another tradition which is a bit more rationalist, which is down the Locke line, but we pick up on that theological tradition and argue that that is central to personhood. It's a relational quality. And that is why, on our understanding, only humans are persons because of our uniquely relational and communicative abilities.
I wonder then what someone like Peter Singer would say to that, Nick, who I'm sure you're fully aware is a well-known animal rights sort of ethicist, an atheist, but he might, I could imagine, say, well, that's very convenient that you've come up with a definition of personhood that just applies to humans, because he, as I understand it, says we should think about personhood as these abilities, the ability to feel pleasure and pain, perhaps to kind of make plans and that kind of thing. But all of that can apply to certain types of animals.
Yes.
Also, controversially, he's said, and doesn't apply so much to perhaps a child in the womb or even a child who has just been born. And therefore, you need to kind of, there's a sliding scale here of what a person is, and it is, trans species. It's bigger than that. So what do you say to that kind of, that Peter Singer-esque way of thinking of personhood?
So there's lots of very good challenges there. I mean, the first one, which is effectively, pulls the ladder up, Jack, when you're on the top of it, is a perfectly legitimate challenge. What could be said to me is, well, you happen to have defined person. You've retrofitted personhood so that you know that only humans can do it, and then you pulled it on others. And I think that's a fair criticism. I'm open to that. It just so happens that I also think this definition of personhood is, to me, it's the most persuasive, and it's also the one theologically rooted. Singer's other challenge is it's sentience that matters. It's either Hume or Bentham that said the question is not whether it thinks, but whether it feels.
Right.
When dealing with animals, and that's kind of Singer's argument. Again, there's a lot for that. Going back to our earlier conversation, those ideologies that actually downplay feeling to the extent animals don't feel end up abusive. And that's emphatically not where I want to go. But I think it is more than feeling. And also, I would argue, although you cannot ever prove this, that the nature and quality of feeling is changed by cognitive capacity as well, and also in particular by speech. Absolutely not to say that other primates, cephalopods don't feel and think as well. But I think that our uniquely communicative, relational, imaginative capacities lend to us a kind of a particular intensity of sentience that is a qualitative difference from those of other animals. In other words, I do think humans are particular in that regard. But I keep on coming back to that point that, that does not mean that you don't accord to other species a significant degree of respect and care, not least because they're not yours, the gods.
Yeah.
Can we drill down just really quickly, because that's so fascinating, and I just want to hear a bit more about your thoughts on language, the way we're using language to create meaning. We use it imaginatively. We use it to sort of thrash out morality. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that, and about why that's different to other animals who have very sophisticated well, it's probably not right to call them languages, but I think I've definitely heard David Attenborough say that once or twice about, that we're thinking more and more that they have language themselves.
Yeah. So I think that point is absolutely right. I recently learned from a book that other species have what is known as, there are signs that other species have what is known as recursive signs in language. Recursion is a kind of insertions within clauses, if you like.
Okay.
And it was assumed that was a quintessentially human characteristic. Only humans could have a sentence, comma, thought within that sentence, comma, another thought, and then bracket up the other way. And it seems to be that isn't the case in the example of Japanese blue-tits. Birds are very, very clever here. Corvids are extremely clever here, tool using and communicative and all the rest of it. I think it's probably fair to describe the forms of communication of certain species as a form of language, because again, there are signs of dialect within sort of chimpanzee communication. So it fits all those. And going back to an earlier conversation, wipe us off the planet and allow evolution to wind forward another 20, 30 million years or so. And I suspect chimpanzees will be having this conversation, if you like.
Yeah.
So I think that's inherent in it. But I kind of sense that what language does is to supercharge culture and supercharge other awareness as well, so that we are now able to name and to some extent manipulate those things of reality that otherwise were slightly beyond us. And in doing so, it gives us an access both through our own minds and thoughts, through self-reflection, and to some extent through yours. So what I'm doing here, I'm staring both of you in the eye, not at the same time, I'm going from one to the other.
That would be impressive.
And I can tell from, where your eyes are looking at me, the way that, you're nodding, all the rest of it. I have some idea that you have a mind and what's going on in that mind. I hope I'm reading that correctly. You might come and just you saying, I was so bored. But it deepens and sensitizes us to so many of those cognitive and moral faculties that are central to who we are. And as such, I think that then transforms our existence within the creative world.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that is in a way quite a biblical idea, that God speaks, and life appears, and there's a sense in which the word is somehow central.
I think that's absolutely right. And that was one of the things that really occurred to me afresh when when writing the chapter, because yes, you're right. God speaks existence, and Jesus speaks healings. And he communicates in a way to people that, as it were, slipping into the jargon, changes their ontological being from being quintessentially sinners to being forgiven.
Yeah.
Now, as a theologian, James Dunn wrote at one point that, look, the ancient world is awash with people doing miracles, okay? It's awash with inspired teachers. But so many of them used things. Yeah. They used charms and amulets. And there's some examples of this in the Old Testament as well. They used stuff to effect stuff. One of the things that really perplexed Jesus' disciples, he just, he talks and things obey him. Beginning of Genesis is creation. Jesus is part of the beginning of the new creation. And they're both affected by speech acts in the jargon as well. So again, we're speaking existence into reality. We're speaking new existence into reality. And that seems to me to kind of support the idea that Rowan Williams has written about really well, which is that basically creation is a kind of a web of communication, almost. And our ability to communicate in where we can gives us a particularly significant and influential role within that creation.
Well, bringing us right up to the present day and human abilities and what we've done with language, we've even gone to all the effort of creating what are now called large language models in technology. These things that can basically do your 13-year-old's homework for you at a click of a button. AI, I mean, there's been endless headlines, as you say, and you point out in your introduction the fact that, the book could quickly go out of date because the headlines just keep coming. So I guess the big question I want to start with is, in the way that we've talked about aliens potentially being out there, maybe we need to think about them in relation to humans. Animals, do they have rights? Could AI one day have rights, be treated as a person?
I'm not a priori against that, but I think in order to recognise it, we'd have to have some significant changes. And at the moment, the argument of the chapter is we're not thinking along those lines. The argument is this, effectively. Humans are uniquely rational. This is the argument I kind of counter. Humans are uniquely rational. Rationality, we now know, is a matter of information processing.
It's just ones and zeros, basically.
Ones and zeros, lots of ones and zeros,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Computers can process information faster than we do. Therefore, they're more rational than we are. Therefore, they're more human than we are. And this kind of idea that, they're going to become superhuman because they are able to play a billion games of chess at once type thing. Now, that kind of misses out a really important point, which is that we've got bodies. We're physical beings within a physical world. We're contingent. We're dependent. We're fragile. We're vulnerable. We're temporal. All of which means there are goods that we naturally seek and bads that we naturally avoid. That then kind of segues into the whole morality question. So I know what is good for me. I have some idea what is good for you guys, because I know what is good for a human, what is bad for a human. And that then allows me to kind of form my humanity around that and have a kind of active part in the rest of what's bad for a computer. What's good for a computer? I don't think because we focused on their processing power rather than their embodiment with all the factors that come in with that. I don't think they have discernible goods and bads. Might do one day. The point at which we have an AI which is embodied, which is vulnerable, which needs energy sources to survive, needs to dispose of any waste products, so on and so forth. In other words, the closer it comes to the kind of conceptual space that we occupy, I think when we have that AI, we should be thinking about affording it rights. But that's an embodiment question, not a cognitive question.
And is that so? I been doing a bit of work recently on this idea of belonging and this idea that our brain recognizes social injury as literally as it recognizes a physical injury. So
explain social injury to me.
So feelings of isolation, feelings of rejection, your body will literally receive those injuries and try and treat them as if you've cut your arm, basically. And so we're very fragile in that way as well. We're emotionally fragile and relationally fragile. Does that come into it as well?
So it would do. So if you like, if stage one is an AI which is embodied and which needs certain physical things to keep it going, there its goods. It needs to avoid certain physical things that would harm it, there are its bads. It might also come to the point at which it realizes that I, as a single individual AI, can't acquire all the resources I need, all the goods that I need to keep me going. In other words, I've got to hook up with another AI, 2 or 3 AIs. And in partnership together, we might be able to secure the energy source that we need to keep going.
I know those humans are quite convenient batteries. Is that the next stage?
Well, that's the science. That's the science. The fear
Matrix thing.
Yeah. I mean, but even before you get to that, we 3 embodied AIs need to work together to secure. But hang on, what happens if Justin rags on us and then we do all the work and he's the free rider? So that's a classic kind of moral issue,
right? Okay.
Or if we, the 3 of us, secure the resources, then Justin steals them from us. We feel kind of a degree of social injury or betrayal there. That's effectively how groupish humans evolved. I don't, again, see any a priori reason why that shouldn't apply to AI. And then you'd have social injury just as much as you had physical injury. I just think it's a long way away.
I guess my question is, it may be a long way away, but will it ever arrive? Because isn't there just a kind of ultimately a sort of philosophical question here about whether you will ever get an AI that is, in that sense, self-reflective thinking in a genuine way? Because there's a big leap, isn't there, between being able to process information, which obviously we can see AI can do very well, to kind of that meaning anything to you. It means something to us because we're the ones kind of feeding in the information and reading it off the AI. But the AI doesn't actually have any opinions on Shakespeare when it produces a Shakespeare sonnet.
So you're right. Again, going back to my point, I don't see any a priori reason why that could never be the case. As it happens, I don't think it would be.
Okay.
But it could be the case because the meaning to us, again, comes back to the fact that we are shaped by the goods we pursue and the bads we avoid. If an AI was dependent and contingent and vulnerable, and then it needed certain goods, it would all of a sudden start acquiring meaning because the goods that helped it live would mean something positive to it, and the bads that harmed it would mean something negative to it. Meaning is is parasitic on embodiment. I think at least within the created order.
I suppose before we even necessarily get to that point, we are naturally kind of anthropomorphic. We sort of tend to invest kind of humanist-ish qualities on things, and so we're now, obviously, there's the rise of things like AI girlfriends and carers that are sort of somehow AI, and I think there's a very natural tendency, as soon as we encounter something that feels a bit human, to treat it like a human.
Yep.
And so, I mean, is that just going to happen regardless of the sort of the philosophical debate over whether this really is a thinking, feeling thing?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I'm absolutely convinced that printers are motivated by spite, and I've never met a printer that hasn't been personally
I had an argument with a printer just this morning.
Did you?
Yes.
Well, there you go. I have come within a cat's whisker of throwing our printer out of my bedroom window. So angry have I got with it.
There are some great skits on Instagram and TikTok of basically a printer and a PC and a keyboard talking to each other and basically setting up conspiring to make a difficult day for the owner.
Yes.
Yeah.
So aside from printers, which are quite clearly sentient, moral, and wicked, yes, you're right. We naturally anthropomorphize absolutely everything, and as a result, we're more inclined to see those signs of meaning in cognition and consciousness than might already be there, and we have to kind of factor that back in. I would say, just to bring this particular conversation down to earth, not that I'm not concerned about AI. My main concern about AI is what other human beings are going to do with it, rather than what it's going to do to us.
That's interesting.
We had a conversation a couple of series ago now, I think, with Roz Picard from MIT, who said the same thing. When we asked, "Are you nervous about AI?" She said, "I'm not nervous about AI. I'm nervous about people with AI," which I think is a really important distinction, isn't it?
I mean, you obviously talk about this. You at one point talk about the Hawking Harari conviction that AI will attain and surpass humanity.
Yeah.
I mean, at one level, I've sometimes read Harari and think he's rather looking forward to the day when Google takes over. But there have been these sort of moratoriums put in place, people who are genuinely concerned about what humans will do with this technology.
Yeah. I mean, so the Hawking Harari paradox is just a posh way of talking about what we were talking about earlier in terms of your conviction that both Stephen Hawking and Noah Harari have said that humans are basically information processing.
Yeah.
Machines process information, therefore they're more human than we are. We argue against that in the book. Sorry,
Well, it's really that whole question of the moratoriums. Another guest we spoke to, Paul Kingsnorth. Now he's more of a coming at this as a poet and a writer, but he basically said on this show he thinks AI is basically the Antichrist sort of thing. It's demonic, essentially. We're kind of opening up a portal to something we literally don't know really
what's coming through.
What? Yeah. Now, maybe he's speaking in slightly symbolic language or whatever, but I suppose there is this question of are we kind of unleashing something? And yeah, absolutely, it's going to be humans who have done it, but will it sort of basically kind of take over
the singularity thing you're talking about there? Do you mean? Yeah, I mean, I don't buy that in terms of at some point or other AI is going to become conscious, going to reach a singularity, it'll become aware of itself, and then it will start feeding on our brains type stuff. I don't buy that at all, because going back to this point about embodiment, that is so central to the argument in the chapter. I think it's so central to any sense of meaning, to any sense of being. That doesn't keep me awake at night. But where I think there is genuine cause for concern is, I said, it's what other human beings will do. That we are entering into an election period in the US. We think fake news was bad back in 2016 or 2020. You ain't seen nothing yet. Chatting to somebody who kind of works in this area, and I asked them, what's the future? And she said to me, well, for a start, nobody can tell the difference now between an AI fake photo image and a real one. It's so good. You can tell the difference between video, but we're still in the early days of video. She was saying, I was saying, where people get their information sources from? And she said, well, increasingly, this kind of stuff will be watermarked so that there'll be some sort of identifying digital mark of the fact this is from a reputable source. But how many of us were going to investigate that?
Yeah.
And so the way this could be used to manipulate public opinion is absolutely enormous.
Slightly terrifying.
It is. Is there anything about AI as you see it now, but also how it could progress, that you think will put us back in touch with our personhood in a theological sense, that will put us back in touch with our sort of God-given humanity?
I mean, yes. I mean, two things come to mind here. One is, I mean, the first one is very hypothetical, really. If this thing acquires any form of consciousness, sentience, intelligence in the human sense, we would then be faced with the question of how we treat it.
Okay.
And then we might find ourselves in a strangely godlike position, really. Because if this, I mean, I don't think this is going to happen, as you've said, but you have AI that are embodied, that don't just, that think with their skin, as it were, think with their body in the same way as we do, become conscious of their own goods and bads, so on and so forth, and therefore have their own ends that they want to pursue. We, as a creator, would be faced with the question, well, do we allow this creature to pursue its own goods, even if those goods are not the goods that we will for it as a creator? I don't know if that rings any bells for you.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a kind of,
there's some book in the Bible called Genesis where something similar happens. Yeah.
AI is conscious, cognitive, and it wants to do this, and we know this is going to harm it. And it does that. And then what are we going to do to redeem it? That's a possibility. It's a fantastic one. The much more realistic one is what AI does in terms of generating roles in society that could, in theory, liberate us. That's the Elon Musk idea, but may just replace us. If it were the case that AI generates stuff, processes that stops us from having to do stuff we don't like to do, we could spend a lot more time, as it were, staring into one another's eyes, kind of making persons of one another.
I feel like people have thought that before, haven't they? Before the iPhone, before their...
Precisely.
We'll have so much time.
Precisely.
We'd end up just using that time to stare into an iPhone rather than each other's
precisely.
eyes.
And that's why I'm very... And actually, I mean, that would be a problem. I'm more concerned than that. Doing a piece of work on productivity at the moment at Theos. Really interesting. Very briefly, there's a real inclination to improve productivity by replacing normal roles by AI. Now, in lots of cases, that can be done relatively simply. You used to go to a cashier, then we went to an ATM, now I do online banking. Bit of a difficult transition each time. Okay. What happens if you're working in a care home? Particularly if you're caught in a demographic trap that virtually all Western countries are in at the moment, whereby we're going to have far too many more old people than young people.
Yeah.
Last 20 years, we've dealt with this through immigration. There are real problems with that as well, not leasing as other developing countries are aging themselves. So what are we going to do? We'll get AI care home operatives. Now, in one sense, we talk about this in the book, it's better for a lonely person in a care home to have a AI robot visiting them and talking to them than nobody doing so, but it's not as good as your relatives coming.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's that kind of it's that bit of them replacing the bits that are, as you say, quintessentially human. That there's the danger. I mean, there was an interesting quote you had from Nick Cave, one of our favourite musicians here on Re-Enchanting. The invitation is still open, Nick.
Always open.
But he said he reasoned that however convincing sounding ChatGPT's song might be, because a fan had sent him a ChatGPT rendered version of a song of his, and however indistinguishable from a Nick Cave original, he said, it will always be a replication, a kind of burlesque. So Nick Cave seems pretty confident that AI will never be able to be truly humanly creative in that way. I mean, do you share his confidence there?
Again, this all pivots on my argument about whether it's a priori impossible. I keep on going back to the point that in theory, I can envisage this being the case. In other words, again, you have a sufficiently intelligent, embodied, and therefore frail, vulnerable, physical AI. I don't see a priori.
And at that point, that is a person.
That's
basically.
a person, precisely.
Yeah.
At that point, we should stop protesting because we effectively invented something that's so similar to us that it might as well be us.
Right.
Again, I don't think that would happen. I think actually it would be quite stupid to let it happen. But I don't personally see any formal objection why that would be the case. And if that were the case, I think Nick Cave would be wrong in that, look, if this thing was vulnerable and frail and dependent, it could write songs about transcendence. One of the points he makes in the bit we quote in the book is that, the song isn't transcendent because AI has nothing to transcend. It has no contingent, frail, etc. being in order to transcend. And to that extent, at the moment, he's absolutely right.
Do you know what I find interesting, which we kind of touched upon just then, is because this conversation, what makes us us, what makes humans humans, I'm seeing it everywhere. So I wrote a piece just after the Oscars because I looked at all the films that had won Oscars and they were just humans talking to other humans about what it means to be human. It was the same story in every film, and they were incredible films. But in all of them, or in the two in particular, Poor Things and Barbie, this what means to be human, there was this kind of suffering is part of it, and our fragility is part of it, and seeing the bad and sorrow and grief and all of these things, they're precious almost. Now that feels like we're doing a bit of a U-turn, because for so long suffering is something we've wanted to keep way over there and pretend it doesn't happen, and we're not fragile and we're dependent and we're in control. And yet it kind of feels like now that we're creating things that don't suffer and don't grieve and don't mourn and aren't fragile, we're like, oh no, that's a part of us that's really important. Do you see us making a bit of a U-turn in regards to like the value we place on our own, like you've said, like our own fragility in every kind of way?
Yes, I do. I think that's a very good point. I think that the recognition, I've heard lots of people say this, our fallibility that makes us our human, our frailty. And suffering is woven up with that. Where I have some reservations there is that, and I know you certainly weren't saying this, but you don't ever want to slip into the kind of suffering is therefore part of the human condition. We just have to deal with it. Now, in one sense, of course, it is. But if anyone who suffered, you want to stop suffering.
Yes.
You don't celebrate the suffering.
No.
There are good things that can come from it, but in and of itself, it is not a good. And no matter how closely woven into the human condition it is characteristic of the human condition, part of who we are, part of what we have to deal with. But it's not something I want to put on a banner, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely get that. I mean, we've just scratched the surface of a few of these issues, and there are so many more that you deal with so well. And I want to say as well that even though the subtitle, Science, Religion, and the Future of Humanity sounds very grand, this is a really accessible book. It's very sort of, it's a real way into probably a lot of topics people hadn't perhaps thought that much about as well. And I found it really helpful.
Thank you.
So yeah, thank you for kind of re-enchanting these areas, but most of all re-enchanting, as we often do on this show, being human, ultimately, that there's something rather unique about us. I mean, I guess what's your overall take, what you're hoping people take away from the book Playing God once they've sat down and read all the chapters?
Wow. I should have a better kind of elevator answer to that, shouldn't I, really? Don't be scared. Look, not saying there isn't scary stuff out there, but, most generations have had scary stuff to deal with. We do. It could arguably be of a different order. And it's interesting your comments about, centrality of humanity and so many of these things. Yes, these changes are going right into that reactor core, but the history of Christian thought, and in particular reflection within science and religion, has lived in that reactor core, going back to the kind of argument from Magisteria. So don't be too scared about the terrifying headlines about, the alien life that's about to come and eat your brain type stuff. But also don't be scared about the issues that kick off, because here's one way to end. Alien life, where we talked about earlier, quintessentially modern issue? No. Theologians are discussing the possibility of alien life in the 14th century and what that would mean for salvation, what that would mean for the incarnation. We've been here before. We can navigate the future.
Yeah.
Good place to leave it.
That is a perfect place to leave it, although I am reluctant to leave it. But if this has piqued your interest, the book is where you want to go, Playing God. And just to reiterate, I'm exhibit A of the type of person who I thought this book would leave me behind. It absolutely doesn't. It is like an anchor absolutely in these issues.
Yeah, thank you for writing it, and to Hannah, the co-author
absolutely.
of the book.
Yeah.
We'll make sure there's a link from today's show where you can find more about Nick and the book. But for now, thank you so much for being our guest today, Nick.
Real pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to say that we write lots of articles about these types of things on Seen and Unseen, so you can also find things there, and you can add a / give if you want to make future seasons of Re-Enchanting happen.
If you want to support us and help us bring more great guests like Nick on, then that's the place to go. There's a link to that as well from today's show. But for now, from me and Belle here in the crypt, we'll see you next time.